Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. As you can see, we're doing a pre-release video, and this is something that I don't usually do. Usually my pre-release preparation content is just the set reviews, because that's where you get all my thoughts on the cards, and just if you want to figure out what the good cards in the set are, I think it's a good place to look, and I would still recommend that. But I did have a lot of people asking, hey Alex, I want a little bit more info about what I should do in the pre-release, or maybe, you know, they people that didn't get time to listen or watch the entire set review, they want a little bit of preparation going in. So that's what this video is, and I think I found a way to do this pre-release prep video in a way that's kind of very in the style of limited level ups. We're not going to be going through all the archetypes or the top commons or anything like that. What we're going to do today actually is threefold. Number one, I'm going to give you some tips on sealed in general that will apply to other formats. It's not specifically this set what's changing in sealed, but it is good to kind of reinforce and just go over some of the things that do change from draft and sealed. I'm going to talk about some traps that I think are good to avoid, some things that might look kind of enticing but aren't actually very good. And as you can see here, I've laid out a bunch of cards to talk about, ones that I think that are going to be a little bit underrated, or cards that might not look as good as they actually are. So really, this is alerting you to the cards that are better than they look, the cards that are worse than they look, tied in with a few just general sealed tips. All right, so let's kick things off with some general sealed tips. So number one, people often ask me, what are the best archetypes for sealed? And it doesn't really matter that much, to be honest, because what you open is what you open, right? You're just going to play the best cards in your pool. It's not like draft, where if you go into a draft knowing, hey, red-black's a really good deck and blue-white's a really good deck, you can start to bias towards those. In sealed, your best deck in your pool might be in the worst archetype in the set, right? Like, for example, in Wilds of Eldraine, where green-blue wasn't particularly good, my pre-release deck, the best deck in that pool was a good blue-green deck. So while it's good to understand that as the format goes on, I don't think you need to really think about, okay, what are the best decks and what should I build towards? Just build towards what your best cards and your strongest cards are. Another thing to touch on for sealed is just the kind of cards that go up in value a little bit compared to where you might value them for draft. And I'm talking a little bit, you know, you're turning the knob just a little bit. Sealed is slower by, I would say, you know, half a turn or a turn. So, while it doesn't mean that you're going to be playing these 15-turn games very often, it does mean that certain slightly slower cards do become considerations. So, for example, card draw, Ancestral Reminiscence, where this is a card that I'm not that excited to play in my draft deck, but that turn or half turn slower, especially when some sealed games can really come down to a grind, I'm interested in playing this card a little bit more. Expensive counterspells, or just counterspells in general, like Hurl into History, another thing that goes up a little bit, where in sealed, you do want catch-all answers to gigantic bombs that maybe have a good end to the battlefield effect, where just a removal spell wouldn't answer them. Sealed being ever so slightly slower also means that if you do pass the turn with a counterspell and your opponent doesn't cast anything or nothing you want to counter, you don't feel that bad about wasting the mana, where in draft, it's kind of a disaster if they do that. And then lastly, just these big expensive cards, like something like Ghalta. In draft, Ghalta's just like, you know, an 8-mana 12/12, which is, you know, fine, it's good, but 8 mana is a lot. I really want to put that forth. 8 mana is a ton, and in sealed, it's like, ton adjacent, right? It's like, I'm okay playing this card if I think I need some top end, where I would really shy away from it in draft because 8 mana is just very difficult to get to. Okay, time to talk about some traps, time to talk about some cards that maybe are a little bit better than they look. I have played in the early access streamer event. That's why I do have the cards on Arena right now. I'm playing on that alt account that they gave me, so I also have a little bit of experience in addition to doing my set review and really thinking about the card. So one thing that I know a lot of people are going to be sad about, but I come bearing bad news, is that I do not think the cave deck is particularly good, and especially in sealed, where it's very difficult to just open enough caves and payoffs to be able to make that deck functional. I would shy away from that. So we've got Calamitous Cave in here, which I think is the best of the bunch, right? The best of the payoffs for the cave deck. And there's one in each color, and maybe, you know, a few more scattered in there from in some lands and some other cards. This one's quite strong. Wiping the board, dealing 4 or 5 damage. This is a good payoff, but the other payoffs, stuff like Bat Colony, which is okay, and there's the big 5/5 lifelinker that gets cheaper for each cave you control. Those cards are good, but the problem is you have to have so many caves to make those work. To make any of these payoffs work, you need about, I would say, 9 caves at a minimum, and you only open 6 packs, and in those packs, you can have more than 1 cave, but it's just not that likely. So it's the combination, especially in sealed, that number one, when you actually do get there on the deck, I don't think the cards are all that strong, aside from the cave-in. And number two, it's just going to be very difficult to get to the number of caves you need. And I think people are going to make the mistake of oh, I opened some cave payoffs and I have 6 caves in my deck or in my sealed pool. That's not enough. So I'm not saying you can never have this deck be the best deck in your pool, but to actually make it a consideration, you need, like I said, a minimum of 8 or 9 caves, and that's kind of on the lower end of things, plus some of the better payoffs like Calamitous Cave-In. So just proceed with caution. So I pulled aside here some cards that I think are kind of either tough to evaluate, or the type of card that I think people often misevaluate, or in the case of a few here, cards that look like cards from previous sets that weren't very good, but there's a little something going on here that makes them a little bit better. So let's just start with red, starting with Diamond Pickaxe and Sunfire Torch. So Diamond Pickaxe is just a good card. This is a card that is like Gold Vein Pick from Call Time if you played that. That was quite a strong card. And Sunfire Torch is a card that I would also say is just a good card. It's sort of the shock variant, the deal 2 of this set, but has the additional upside of being a artifact for the cards that care about that, and there is a lot of that in this set. Also, you know, if you don't want to shock anything, you can just put it on a small creature, enable an attack. I call these out because equipment usually are pretty bad and limited, especially the common equipment floating around. These are not bad. These are good cards. Don't hesitate about putting them into your deck. You, of course, need a good creature count, you know, 14 or so creatures at least, to have equipment be a relevant card in your deck, or else too often you'll have non-functional draws. But in general, you can just feel pretty safe about putting these two in. And there is a lot of equipment in this set that actually is still kind of junky and I would shy away from, so these are the exceptions. Atali's Favor is another one that is kind of hard to evaluate. You're like, all right, it's an aura, +1/+1 and trample, discover 3. I think this is just a pretty good card. You just put it in most of your red aggressive decks. Sort of like the equipment here, where you do need a good creature count, 14, 15 plus. But just imagine the situation of, I play a 2-drop, I play Favor on it on turn 3, I discover another 2-drop, you effectively made your 2/2 a 3/3 with trample, and you get another 2-drop that turn. So just a pretty effective card. Of course, be careful about casting it into open mana. The earlier you cast this, the better. Moving on to blue now, I got 4 cards here. So another one that's kind of tricky to evaluate. This is Inverted Iceberg. And when I was doing the set review with my set review partner, Mark, I was actually pretty low on this card, and he talked me up on it. And after playing it today, I definitely agree it's a strong card. So the way you want to think about this card is it's like a 2-mana draw 2, except one of the cards you draw is a 6/6, this Iceberg Titan here. And of course, Million card is relevant, not only for maybe Million artifact to craft with this thing, but just because Descend is a mechanic in this set where you care about things going to the graveyard. So this is just a solid card. I would be happy to play this in a deck with a reasonable artifact count, you know, somewhere in the 7, 8, 9 range. And of course, anything that makes treasure also counts. Zoetic Glyph, sort of similar, a card that looks, maybe this one is obviously good, but I think auras are generally hard to evaluate because we hear, oh no, auras are bad, but this one is definitely a good aura. And actually I had Sam Black today put a Zoetic Glyph on the pick that we just talked about, and that pick is indestructible too. So he had a 5/4 indestructible, and he actually had a way to give it vigilance too, and I very easily lost that game. Basically what Zoetic Glyph does is makes a treasure or any little trinkety artifact, heck, an inverted iceberg, into a massive threat, and then it's really difficult for your opponent to face that, because, okay, and obviously the foil to put aura on my creature is, well, I just cast a removal spell, but you cast a removal spell, unless you're hitting it right in response to them casting this, they're going to also discover 3, so they get a little bit of value back. Really strong card. Tashana's Tidebinder is a rare, but I do want to call it out as way better than it looks. So this kind of looks like a weird trinkety, like, alright, it's a 3/2 flash for 3, maybe it counters an activated ability here and there. This set is full of activated abilities. You can counter a craft ability, and they actually exile their cards and they don't get them back. You can counter a cycler, so they just discard a card and they don't get that. So many things in this set have activated abilities. Like, if you're just going through the list of cards here, almost all of them I'm looking at actually have an activated ability. So this is much better than it might be in some formats, and don't just put that aside as like, oh, weird, rare. This is a pull into blue. And then the last blue card I want to call out here is Clockwork Wrestler, and this is the kind of card I think is a little bit underrated in general. It just is a little bit tricky to figure out what you're doing with the card. It's okay, it's this like little 1-mana 1/2, and you can kind of just think of it as a defensive card in any blue deck. If you played Lord of the Rings, there was that spell that amassed 1 and gave something -0, -3, or sorry, -3, -0, and Deceive the Messenger, and that was a great card. This is a very similar card. It also has the benefit of being an artifact, and the way this plays out, if you haven't played these little, you know, blue, give a thing -2 plus a little creature, is, well, this just eats X ones, right? So something like if your opponent attacks with a Mischievous Pup into you, you go, all right, -2, it's a 1/1, I block it. That's pretty nice. It also helps in double blocks. You go for a double block that, maybe a 2/2 and a 2/2 on their 4/4, and you give their creature -2. You get 1/2, and only one of your 2/2s dies. It blows that combat trick, so it just does a lot of little tiny things. I would be pretty happy playing a copy or two. Moving on to black here, we've got 3 cards, and looks like 4, but this one is just as a placeholder talking about Defossilize, which is a 5-mana reanimation spell, and generally these tend to not be very good. It's kind of hard to get your money's worth for your 5 mana. You reanimate like a 3-drop or a 5-drop, and it's like, all right, I paid 5 mana for a small creature. This one has the additional bonus of exploring twice, which is quite good. Putting a counter on and drawing a land really makes it quite a different card. But the format context that makes this and a few other reanimation spells a little bit better than they look is there is the cycle at 1 in each color of these land cyclers. So the joke here is you discard this early, and then on turn 5, you're going to get your giant rampaging Spiketail. This isn't even one of the better ones to get back. There's the green one, which is a 7-mana 5/5 that comes with a 3/3 token. It's probably one of the better ones to get back. So don't count this out, especially if you have some cyclers in your deck. Tithing Blade. Man, this is a tricky card, and I actually haven't quite nailed down how much I like it, but I think it's a card that you look at it for the first time, you're like, I have no idea how to evaluate this. I think I like it more than I dislike it. It's got some issues where if you're facing like a black-white deck and they're like, cool, I sacrificed my 1/1 that was good to get sacrificed, or, just something that they don't really care about, it's been sitting around for a while. Against the big green decks, of course, it's much better. They sacrifice their 4/4 because they had just a 4/4 and a 5/5. So it's a bit matchup dependent, and you do maybe want to sideboard this out aggressively, but I would start with this card, at least a copy in my main deck and sealed. You're going to get something out of it, right? You're going to be able to nab something. These sacrifice a creature effects aren't that good and limited in general because they get a choice. And like I mentioned, they can sacrifice a small thing. But that backside, consuming Sepulcher, makes it so that it's reasonable to play this, even if it's not the best on the front side. And sometimes you face that big green deck, cast Tithing Blade, and you get rid of their big thing. And the next turn you get the Sepulcher going, which does start to drain them and slow kind of make the game in favor of you, because the pressure's on them. If nothing happens in the game, they're just going to lose to this. So I would proceed with caution with this one too, but if it looks like a very bad card to you, bump it up a little bit. I would be fine playing my first copy of it. And then Deathcat Marionette, which doesn't look like a super exciting card, but I do think is one of Black's better commons. It really helps all of the decks that are trying to descend, and a lot of Black decks do care about descending. Milling 2 cards is a big deal. If that gets you half the way to descend 4, which is kind of the first descend number, that's a really big deal. Trades with the big bombs, trades with the cheap creatures. Nothing that I don't like about this card. Moving on to white now, we've got another playable common equipment in Deconstruction Hammer. So 1 mana to play to 1 mana to equip. It's kind of your going rate for +1/+1 on an equipment. And then that ability, 3 tap and sack it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. It's not some situational thing that you might find in some sets where it's like, oh, maybe they opened a good rare, like a Horn of Gondor or something. There are a ton of artifacts in this set and a decent amount of enchantments, so it's going to be relevant most games. Similarly, Dauntless Dismantler. This is a card that you're going to want to play a little bit more if you don't have as many artifacts as, maybe some people, if you're like 5, 6 artifacts, maybe a little bit lower, so that last ability there doesn't harm you. But I don't mind playing this in any white controlling or slower deck. 1/4 is a good body. Your opponent's artifacts entering tap is like semi-relevant. And sometimes you're going to face up an opponent just has a bunch of these small artifacts, and they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Play my other 2 mana artifacts and then they just activate the bodyguard and blow them all up? Your opponent really does have to think, and it's pretty low opportunity cost, right? Like a 2 mana 1/4 is a good defensive body. I think you should generally play this card if you're in white, and especially if you are, like I mentioned, not that heavy on the artifacts. Tinkerer's Toe. This one's not too complicated. It's just a artifact that makes 3 artifacts, which is very strong, and the effect that it gives is pretty good in general. Just 3 mana, make 2 tokens. It's a little bit below rate. You really wanted that to be 2 mana, but being an artifact really matters. Being able to sacrifice for 3 life really matters. This is one of white's better commons, and it should pull you into white. I've got Clay Fired Bricks here, or Clay Fried Bricks as I called it in the set review. And this one is kind of just a standard as well. This is a good card, but a standard for me just to talking about craft. And I've talked about some craft cards, but craft is one of the more successful mechanics, I would say. Easy to build around, easy to do. I found almost all the craft cards just to be good, and there might be 1 or 2 in there that I would prefer not to play. But if you're looking at your craft card and you're like, I don't know, is this a good card? I would say more yes than no, almost across the board. And then Mischievous Pup is just one I want to call out that is another pull into white, I believe. Just being able to pick up all these small artifacts is good into the battlefield effects, or maybe save a creature. Sort of similar to Stockpiling Celebrant, like we saw in Wilds of Eldraine, where you can pick up your value spells that you've played. But of course, Flash adds a whole new dimension, being able to save those creatures in response to removal or like a combat gone wrong or something like that. And then the very last thing I want to mention is just these cheap Explore creatures, and talk about Explore just for a second in general. So Explore is just a powerful mechanic, being able to draw you into more lands or buff your creatures. All these small Explore creatures are good cards. I do think that if we're talking about less successful archetypes, the blue-green Explore deck is not particularly good because there's just not a lot of Explore to go around. Like, there are Explore payoffs here and there, but it's really difficult to fill your deck with, 6-7 Explore cards. There's just not that many in the set. So they're good odds as standalone cards, but I wouldn't be like, oh, I've got 3 or 4 Explore cards, let me build an Explore deck, because you need more enablers for that than 3 or 4 cards, and the payoffs just won't work as often as you want them to. So tying this all back around to, I mentioned at the beginning, like, don't worry too much about your archetypes. Hey, if you open that pool with a bunch of good Explore cards and the Explore payoffs, I'm not saying don't go into it. I'm just saying that those pools aren't going to be opened all that often. And in general, I would just say that as a last word going into the pre-release, have fun, be kind to your opponents, and one more just strategic thing is, I don't think anything aside from maybe this Explore theme and the Caves theme is like a trap. And let me know if you want to hear anything else about my thoughts going into pre-release weekend, or if you like this video. All right, good luck, and we'll see you later.